This is the best practices in data visualization panel, just to make sure you're in the right place. So I am Todd Margolis. I'm a product manager at Click, and my focus is on collaboration there and how we can enhance team analytics. So my research investigates how to use emerging technologies for improved kind of human-computer interaction. I've been doing this kind of stuff for over 20 years, creating these telecollaborative, immersive, and interactive artwork and platforms. And I've published numerous papers on mixed reality art and interaction and lectured internationally on immersive analytics. My work has been shown in museums, festivals, galleries, TV, and radio around the world. That's more than enough about me. I hate giving my own bio, but next I'm going to introduce Daniel Sol Hoon. Is a product management professional on data visualization at Pegasystems, a company that has software development platform for enterprises and offers software solutions for marketing. So marketing, sales, and customer service, all of that. Previously, Sol worked at a number of software startups in analytics and the data visualization space. He lives in San Francisco with his wife and their 1-year-old daughter, Erin. Welcome, Sol.
Thank you.
So next we have Amelia Abreu. Thank you. Sorry, even though
like the baseball player.
So she's a design researcher and the founder of UX Night School, based in Portland, Oregon. She has worked with teams at Nike, Mozilla, Microsoft Research, and Intel, as well as startups and cultural organizations. She holds graduate degrees in human-computer interaction and information studies from the University of Washington and the University of Texas, Austin. Her writing has appeared in the New Inquiry, Motherboard, and Model View Culture, and she has been featured as a commentator on the BBC and Wired. Awesome. Thank you very much for joining us, Amelia. Next, we have Breck Yunits over here, over right here. And so Breck is a researcher working on programming languages and data visualization at Ohio, Ohio? Yeah, Computer. Previously, he was an engineer at Microsoft working on web apps and data analytics for Azure. Before that, he co-founded Nudge, which is a web IDE startup supported by Mozilla Web FWD and Y Combinator and acquired by Microsoft. Congratulations. He started as a software engineer at Lab Zero in San Francisco and now lives with his fiance in Seattle. Thank you for joining us, Breck. And then finally, last but not least, we have Efrem Rensi, who is an independent software developer. As a mathematics PhD student at UC Davis, he designed visualizations of astrophysical accretion disk models and developed several visualizations relating to approximating circuit simulation models as part of his dissertation research, including eigenvalve decompositions and transfer function representations in the complex frequency domain. There'll be a quiz on this later, so I'm hoping you'll have some good questions about that. Post-academia, he's worked on scraping sex offender registries and currently develops an animated visualization for geographic activity data. That is quite an interesting, varied background. Thank you for joining us, Efrem. All right, so we've got some questions that we've prepared that I'm going to go and ask our panelists, but I'm really hoping to make this interactive, and if you guys have questions, feel free to raise your hand. We can interject them at any time. If you have follow-up questions, please go ahead, raise your hand, we'll get you a microphone, or you could just shout it out. So first, we're going to start off with something hopefully somewhat easy, and I'm going to ask all of the panelists to share one example of what makes for a good data visualization. And keep this to maybe something that makes it good, not necessarily what's bad, because we're going to have a follow-up question about what makes for bad data visualization. So why don't we start here with Breck?
I would just say it's short and the data is good.
Okay. It's short. So maybe you can expand on what you mean by it's short.
I think there's a great book I love called Storytelling with Data. And it recommends you have one story per visualization. Mm-hmm. So one idea that you want to express. So So keep things to that one idea. If you want to tell multiple stories, create a separate chart, create a separate visualization. It's great to have 10 visualizations, 10 pages, but I recommend keeping things short. And then ultimately, like, it's all about the data. So spend most of your time on the data. Your data is going to outlive your code, always. I've never seen a case where that wasn't the case. So focus on cleaning data and then keep your visualizations short and simple.
Great, thank you. Amelia, you want to go next?
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on what you said about the data is good. Well, what does it mean to have good data? I mean, I feel like one thing would be context. Where is this data from? Who collected it? How was it collected? I think we're having a real watershed moment about how we as users have data collected on us. And this makes us all see, okay, well, where does this come from? Where do these numbers come from? What's the context? And I think that's one of the big challenges in doing good data visualization is providing that context along with the awesome visualization.
Yeah, to me, the good visualization has multiple components. One is what Breck touched on, which is has a very clear story and objective. And secondly, it has the methodology of where the data came from and how it's being represented. So you need to be able to see the steps that has been done on the transforming that data into a projection. Thirdly, it needs to be actionable. So just by looking at the pretty picture and just staring at it doesn't seem to me that makes a great data visualization. You need to be able to take actions by looking at the data visualization.
So actually, I'm going to ask for a little bit of a follow-up there, because I think that's very important. I agree, but it's also very broad, and maybe it goes. Is that the role of the developer or the designer to enable that action? So I mean, the action might be being able to annotate a chart. It might be being able to share that chart, to someone. It might be able to add some sort of task management or business process automation into the system for visualization. So which one of those specifically do you mean?
I think it touches all those things, and as well as providing an action that you can do on itself when it comes to a software visualization for businesses. But I think it also the reason why the actionable component is a little bit tricky because it sits in between many of the disciplines that touches around it. So you need to be able to, in order to provide a action, relevant actions from a data visualization, you need to be a domain expert, actually knows the space, as well as aesthetically that you need to be able to project the visualization in that actually touches the action, but also having some technology understanding that what actions are feasible to be taken on the data visualization. So those three overlaps that makes it really tricky to come up with the right actions to be, or even the list of actions to consider, in my opinion.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it depends on what you want to present. I mean, are you making a point with your data visualization? If you're trying to make a point, then it should be very intuitive. A person shouldn't have to look at documentation about your visualization. They shouldn't have to search through a bunch of keys and stuff. It should be fairly. It should be pretty obvious what they're looking at, but data visualization doesn't have to make a point. It can have artistic value as well. I think what's a good data visualization really depends on what it is you want to do.
Right. So that's a great point. And something actually I'm somewhat surprised maybe wasn't specifically mentioned is really about choosing the right type of data visualization to communicate the point, right? I wanted to mention on most of the tables here, you'll see some handouts on the table. And this is a guide that is feel free to take them. That is one example of how you can choose the right type of visualization based on what question are you trying to answer, right? Is it a distribution? Are you doing a comparison? Is it time series? How many things are you comparing? All of those are really important factors on choosing the right visualization style.
Could I say something? Yeah, and there's two big categories of data viz. It's exploratory and explanatory. So exploratory is when you don't know the story that you want to tell, you're just looking at the data and you want to figure out what's going on. So depending on what you're doing, there's different practices for both. And then in choosing the right type of visualization, I think one thing that's really an interesting trend is seeing neural nets and other types of AI create recommendations. Google does some pretty good ones now. Amazon QuickSight, Click, I'm sure, does some awesome stuff. And that seems to be a big trend that can kind of help in that regard, because mastering all the different types and knowing when to apply them is a really difficult problem that's better done by AI, in my opinion.
Wow. I gotta digest that one. So if I understand what you just said, choosing the right type of visualization may be better done by AI rather than a human. Is that what you're proposing?
In the future, I believe that's the case. In the next 5 years.
Right, okay. That's a huge can of worms I want to go into, but I'm going to hold on to that for just a little bit, because I think that's a really interesting claim. You want to respond?
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, just
We're
to
going to
add.
derail it. We're going to dive in.
Just to add that, there's a project called Voyager from University of Washington that starts to, gather some data around people's preference of how certain data sets should be visualized. So I think, if I'm not sure they actually keep track of the people making those selections, but I think if they do, I think it'll be a great resource for understanding, in what data or what situation or what question that they're trying to answer, based on the intention, what visualization actually makes sense and resonates with the users.
I mean, there's a question of who is the data visualization for? And when I hear the binary of exploratory and explanatory, it's the, exploratory is for me, so I can figure out what the story is. Explanatory is I'm building something for the rest of the world to tell them that story. And I don't know how I feel about, how do we add those layers of AI? I mean, there are certain things that computers are better at doing than people, are more reliable at doing. But there's certain things that people are much better at doing in that realm.
Yeah, I think that it's important to also recognize that, there is definitely, from a developer point of view, I think actually what you say is very, very true, that, there are these kind of different modalities, right? When you're actually sort of being presented to, that's maybe more of a explanatory process, right? You're in a meeting, the executives want to be able to look at a report, but hopefully, I think there's a trend, at least I'm advocating for a trend, to push for more active debate in meetings, right? So being able to dynamically change between the presentation mode and analysis mode is really important. Because you can imagine, let's say, just your Monday morning sales meeting, someone is saying, well, sales are down for, this last quarter, but then one of the regional directors is saying, well, actually, no, sales are, or the first guy said it, and it's because of, there's a shortage on, dairy or whatever. And so another regional director can say, well, actually, that's not true. In my region, it's not. And then you can dive directly into the data and ask that question, right? But it's complicated to do that, right? I guess I'll maybe ask that question to everyone else is, how do we kind of segment the interaction modalities between, being in a presentation or reporting mode versus being in that discovery mode? Let's start with Efrem.
Can you repeat that? Yeah. Okay.
Well, how do
well,
we?
First of all, I would like to mention that my experience with data visualization is quite limited. I'm really flattered to be on this panel, to be honest. But Yeah, I've never actually done persuasive data visualization. I've never tried to convince people of anything with my visualizations. Usually, so I think you mentioned exploratory. But this is basically what I do and have done. I am trying. I have something that I'm working with, and I try to look at it. I try to put it in such a way that my mind understands it better, so that I can work with it. And this happens in math a lot. And this is kind of what I excelled. Well, this is what I did as a math. In math, this is what I really tried to reduce everything that I worked with into some kind of picture.
Yeah, but I guess, I mean, at some point, you have made an insight, right, on the data you're investigating. And do you ever feel the need to communicate that insight externally? Or is it really more just for you? And it's just an artifact once that you've made that insight?
I hope... Yeah, yeah. I mean, I hate to say it. Yeah, it is very much for me, and I really hope that other people can identify with it as well in any type of visualization that I make.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm kind of in the same boat. I love making visualizations for me and exploring data, and I think maybe one thing that we're getting at is there are tools for doing that. It's not accessible right now, and I think it's getting better. Qlik, actually, I think in terms of mobile data viz apps, by far, that's the best I've seen. But I haven't found, I don't use I use Fitbit and I look at data a lot on my phone, and New York Times does some great stuff, but it's still, I think, to get to the point where people can just, work with data as easily they can edit a Word doc or something. I think that'd be a great step, and hopefully we'll get there.
Anybody else want to comment on this, or should we move on?
I mean, yesterday I had part of my presentation was to explain the difference between the data insight and the final visualization. So you do between data and insight, you do the exploratory data visualization and do a lot of iterations to find that insight. But once that insight has captured, and insight can be just anything, but the rule of thumb that I use is that, oh, this is interesting, I want to actually tell my friends about it. That's the question that I ask consistently on the data and different projections that I do on the exploratory side. Once that question has been answered yes, then I move on to the visualization phase. And it usually involves the same sort of visualization that I did with the exploratory, but not necessarily. And that actually involves another iterative cycle that from the insight, how do I best project and come up with the best projection of that insight into a custom or somewhat more elaborate visualization. So those are the differences that I try to have in mind when I work with the exploratory and the explanatory.
Great, thank you. All right, so then let's maybe back up for a second and talk about what are some of the common mistakes that you see people making when building data visualizations?
Maybe I'll start. So I'm not going to mention any of the tactical stuff, don't size your bubble based on the radius. I mean, those are very common mistakes. To represent the volume of the data should be the area of the circle that has been represented, and not the radius. If you use that, then that exaggerates the results. But more importantly, from a conceptual side, I think the common mistakes that people make is that they already have come up with, before even they start creating a data visualization, they already have an intuition that what the data might speak. And actually, trying to cram that intuition into the visualization. And that's when all the bad practices actually happen. So I think that's the very common mistake that people make. Don't try to come up with any pre-understanding or preconceived notion about the data, because it may actually tell a completely different story. That's number one. For the developers who are out there, when marketing or any other department actually asks you to come up and create a data visualization, start with the modular. Because even though they may sound like they're asking one-offs, they will always come back and ask for more. Especially when the visualization really takes off, whether it's internal corporation or externally through the application. So it's much better to start modular and refactoring, very early on, even though nobody asks you to do it, because there's marketing person or salesperson always going to come back and ask you, can you add this? It's so simple, but why does it take 2 weeks to actually do that? That kind of question. So it'll be much better off if you start with a better structure.
Amelia, you want to go?
God, I think the most common mistake I see is not taking into account like very widespread. Let me start over. The most common mistake I see is making data visualizations that will not make sense to someone with red-green color blindness, which is 10% of the male population.
Color blindness.
Yeah, so 10% of men are red-green colorblind, which means if you build a data visualization that has red and green opposed, 10% of the dudes who see it will make sense out of it. And this is very common. A friend of mine was dropping me off at the airport, and at the PDX airport there are these little lights over the parking spots, and they're red or green depending on if there's a car in there or not. And he said, "Oh, these don't do anything for me." And I was like, "What?" And he's like, "I'm colorblind." It had never come up in conversation before. And similarly, 80% of adults over the age of 40 need reading glasses. So what makes sense to you visually is, often might not make sense to someone else, even on a fundamental level.
That is a great point. I'm colorblind, and so for traffic lights specifically, one of the techniques that I use is relying on consistency. And so usually red is at the top and yellow is in the middle and green is at the bottom. There's an intersection right outside of my house where it's always flashing red going in on one street, and then on the other street it's always flashing yellow. And they decided to put the yellow at the top. So to me, it looks like both are always flashing red. And I see people getting confused all the time. And I know that that person must be colorblind because they're stopped and other people aren't stopped. And it's a horrible, horrible design. So be consistent and follow accessibility guidelines for sure.
That's funny. It's a trap for colorblind people, I guess.
Totally. Yeah.
I think I really liked, I won't comment on small tactical mistakes, but the strategic mistakes. And I would second that. When you create a data viz, you're gonna edit it. People are gonna tell you to change it. So spend as much of your time as you can on your data and making your data accessible, and as little time as possible on your visualization, your code, because your data is always gonna outlive your code. And also, when you have your story, always just assume that your story might be wrong. So, just think when you're doing data, it's important to be honest, and you want to make a really clear and easy to understand story. But this is one thing that sometimes the New York Times or Wall Street Journal, I think they don't admit enough possibility that, hey, we may be wrong, and why don't you take a crack at this yourself and see if you can find your own story. So I think that is a big thing. And then the other mistake is not using SQL. I've never heard a development team in a long-lived product say, "Oh, I wish we hadn't used SQL." Have heard the opposite. "Oh, I wish we had started with SQL because we eventually had to move it over." So I think SQL is a pretty reliable technology that you can bet on for your data.
Efrem, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, maybe this is the wrong crowd, but overuse of new technology,
Wrong city also.
well,
New technology quickly becomes old technology.
Yeah, not everything needs to be displayed via virtual reality headset, or and it seems like it seems like that's kind of the direction that a lot of visualization is headed right now. And I feel like I'm kind of swept up in it too. In order to be competitive, or in order to have a product that people are going to think is relevant, I feel like I need to embrace more of these technologies, which might really not be necessary. It might kind of get in the way of the data, you know.
Yeah, I would just follow up with that.
But actually, I mean, I saw your talk, and
Yeah.
yes, your virtual reality expression of, or the 3D expression of the molecule, was it? Well, never mind.
Well, so I mean, actually, I totally agree with you. I would just add, don't believe the hype. Like you made a statement there that like everything, there's a lot of pressure to, use emerging technologies. The reality is that no one's really using emerging technologies. It's much more a media kind of story, and it's not the reality. I mean, we don't. Click is a huge company. We have, customers all over the world, enterprise customers, and, we do these examples using augmented reality and virtual reality and large displays, generally more about proof of concept and platforms and speculation about the future. But what is really interesting is thinking through what the technology really has to offer. What's unique about augmented reality or virtual reality or touch displays, and leveraging the specific characteristics of that medium. And then you start actually getting towards useful business scenarios. But actually, since we kind of broached the subject, I'd like to maybe ask another question. We are getting sort of near the end of the panel. Where do you see data visualization going? And I'm going to focus it a little bit more. We've kind of skimmed around the subject of context. So data, being transparent in your data, making sure that people understand where the data came from. I think right now there's a political sort of context and debate around truth and data in general. Look at just what's happening with global warming. Is it a fact? Is it not a fact? It's very subjective, even though there's a lot of data out there and visualizations. So, what can we do as experts, or at least very experienced people in the field, to help provide more trust in data visualization in the future?
Take it. I think we got to make it a lot better, 100 times better. I think in 10 years, what I see is I think data viz, people are going to look at data viz like they read the newspaper today. So they're going to rely a lot less on narratives and someone telling you the story, and they're going to rely a lot more on looking at the data. And I think, so we have a long way to go to make that easier and faster. But I think it's important. I think like the global warming example shows, if we don't do that, then I think we're in trouble because we have to convince a lot of people to act. And so I think we need to make data viz 100 times better and easier.
So I'm going to follow up because you talked about journalism. So we have two partners at Click, EasyOp and Narrative Science, and they focus on natural language generation. They use AI to take data and dynamically generate a story based on that data. And believe it or not, a lot of the news that you see in newspapers are being generated by bots right now. So who's ever read an Associated Press article right now, like in this room? Associated Press, have you heard of them? Right? Probably most of you. So believe it or not, they actually rely on using NLG and AI to generate a lot of their stories, especially most of the sports stories that you read are actually not written by a human. They're written by bots. And so maybe specifically, if the public knew that, do you think that that's something that's going to imbue more trust or less trust in the reader? I'm asking you since you brought it up.
I think it'd be useful to know that information, but I think that's cool. I think if it was accompanied by a picture of the data, and then so the reader could have a choice. Hey, do you want to read the narrative form, or do you just want to look at the pictures? I think that'd be really cool. And even if knowing, I don't know if I've ever read something good. Well, I guess I have.
You probably have and just don't know it. Yeah. If it was good.
So I've read a lot of things that seemed like they were written by computers, but they were written by humans. But I think that would be cool to have some transparency on that. I think I didn't know. That's really interesting.
I mean, to me, it's the optimization of a human's interface. So like humans, we see things, hear things, and seeing things by reading it. And that's one of the optimization that computer can actually bring to the table that, when we actually call the customer service call center, we hear automated voice messaging, and we don't really question what they say. I mean, they don't really say much. They're mostly routing, but I think that the automated writing aspect could be actually looked at, a similar way. Although writing to many of you and many other people might have special nuance or a feeling to it. To answer the direction and the trust question, I keep coming back to the methodology part, but I think the visualization has it's a very powerful medium to distill a lot of data and present it in a very concise way to tell a very powerful story, but it has the same similar pitfall as a statistics. You could manipulate numbers to tell the story that you would like to tell, and sort of in a deceiving way. And visualization actually has the same potential mistakes, and in many ways that we see the data visualization. So I believe that I think the one of the things that we do is we bury the methodology part in a very small print on the at the bottom of the visualization, and many of them actually doesn't even have those. So I really, and I don't have the answer to this yet, but I think it needs to be those methodology explanation needs to communicate it in a more visual way and more upfront to the consumer of the visualization. And that's the directional thinking that I'm having. But I think there's a lot of challenges to actually make that happen. But I think it almost requires that in order to really clarify the misinterpretation that could be happening on the when somebody looks at the visualization.
Right.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up with what you said about this idea. We're all testing a hypothesis when we go out to, when we start a data visualization project, or even, we're testing the hypotheses that people want to listen to us talk by having this panel. But, I think we need a better public discussion around the human effort that surrounds computation. If we're, there's always human labor, there's always human perspective, even behind things that seem very slick and computer generated. And where do we find the literacy in reading visualization? Where do we find the literacy in pushing back on the hypothesis that's presented to us? And this is a really big societal challenge. You often hear this phrased as social constructionism for the elite, but positivism for the masses. Like, we in this room can say, oh, well, it's all socially constructed, but then, we go out into the world and we say, oh, well, global warming is definitely real, and you're a fool for questioning it. Where do we find that middle ground? I don't know, but I think that making data more human, and while finding, no.
Sorry.
Oh, no problem.
We're about to wrap up. Sorry to cut you off. I wanted just real quick, maybe Efrem, if you can also share your thoughts on where are we going with data visualization in your mind?
There's a lot of data being gathered from. This is such an open-ended question. What data visualization? Are you talking about in the news? Like, are you talking? See, this is what I meant by persuasive data visualization versus like artistic data visualization. I think all visualization is data visualization. Right? That I would argue that. So where are we headed with it? Well, we're headed wherever visualization is headed, wherever the human eye, or if if visualizations are projected directly into our brains, that's where we're headed. I mean, I think that's where we're headed.
All right. I love that idea. Projected into our brains. That's where we're headed. All right. Totally dystopic.
No thanks.
So I'm gonna maybe ask one last yes/no question. Just go down the row. I know that we need to wrap it up. So talked a little bit about data transparency and Lineage and being more open with context. So do you imagine there's a Wiki Foundation is now recently released something called Wikidata. I encourage you to check it out. It's a new data repository. It's an open source kind of data repository. But it sort of brings to mind, is there an opportunity for a kind of peer review data visualization framework where, to combat this kind of fake news, whatever, alt facts, is that something that can be solved by crowdsourcing? Or will we end up with more polarized perspective and people just kind of glomming onto their camp and sort of ending up with echo chambers? Does that kind of make sense? Is there an opportunity for a peer-reviewed system? So, real fast, down the line, what do you think?
I don't like the idea of centralized data like Wikidata, like a Wikipedia. I just think, although if you can clone that, that's great. I think that the key is making the tools way better, because if you're telling someone that the car is better than the horse, if you you don't need to sell that to someone. And so if we can make data tools as great as modern automobiles or cell phones or whatever, then I think then we don't have to convince these people, because they'll get it. They'll get the benefits.
Any other thoughts?
I would say yes, but probably in a different levels. So you could think about collaborating on the data level, that if the entry is not incorrect, or there are better sources to support the different values, then those can be almost like how GitHub works for a source code. People can actually fork the data, make changes, back it up with the methodologies and the sources, and the people with better data to support their values would eventually win, hopefully. There's another level that is from the data you have a methodology to visualization. So that, I think, has a lot of room for collaboration to find the optimal projection of the data as well.
Okay.
This brings up the archival concept of provenance. Where did the data come from? Who recorded it? Who touched it?
Yeah, I think it will be harder and harder for people to determine what's real. Or maybe I'm just a little, maybe I just have some psychosis myself or something, or I don't know, but I really feel like it's becoming, data itself and reality itself is becoming more plastic, and I think that having this data repository that you're talking, data repository that you're talking about it will be very difficult to have everybody on board with it, more and more difficult than it has been in the past.
All right. Unfortunately, we do have to wrap it up. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.